contracts, and many contracts, Elon, are right now being looked at, and it may be 6 months, it may be almost a year in some cases. We're going through procedures, we're going through courts, and we'll remember you as we announce billions of dollars of extra waste, fraud, and abuse. Just as an example, DOGE canceled $101 million for DEI contracts at the Department of Education, $101 million.
That was Elon Musk speaking at the first cabinet meeting of the Trump administration, making the case that the Department of Government Efficiency, known as DOGE, would save $4 billion a day, every day, from that moment forward until September. Here is what they chose not to tell you. Not $1 of that target was hit, not because the idea was wrong, not because government isn't bloated, but because the people running DOGE operated as though the Constitution, the actual legal architecture of this country, was an obstacle to work around rather than the map they were required to follow. And while the cameras were on the chainsaw, the debt kept growing. I am John Gray. Let us follow the logic. Here is what is personally at stake for you. The federal government collects 96% of its revenue through the Internal Revenue Service. That agency is now operating with 1/3 fewer auditors than it had at the start of this year. 1/3 gone. The auditors who remain are the ones who process routine filings. The agents who were cut, the revenue agents, the specialists, were the ones who audit corporations, who audit the ultra-wealthy, who audit the people whose accountants have always been better than the government's. Those auditors are gone. So when the Yale Budget Lab tells you that the government could lose $1.6 trillion in uncollected revenue over the next decade, that gap does not disappear. It gets paid by someone else. That someone is you. That is the fundamental error at the center of this story, and it is not the error the mainstream press is covering. On January 20th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order formally establishing the United States DOGE service, housed within the Executive Office of the President. Its mandate, in the words of the order itself, to modernize federal technology, maximize productivity, and cut excess regulations and spending. The legal authority invoked was executive reorganization power, the president's constitutional authority to manage the executive branch. Article 2 of the Constitution. Real authority, legitimate authority. But here is where the logic begins to fracture. The Constitution is not ambiguous on this point. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, the Appropriations Clause, states that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except through appropriations made by law. Law, statute, acts of Congress. And the entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, are not funded through annual discretionary appropriations. They are funded through permanent, indefinite appropriations built into the statutes that created them. The Congressional Research Service confirms this directly. The constitutional function of the Appropriations Clause for these programs was performed when Congress created them, and can only be revisited when Congress amends them. DOGE was never in that room. DOGE cannot enter that room. Only Congress holds the key. Elon Musk promised $2 trillion in annual savings. That was the campaign trail figure. at a rally in Madison Square Garden, October 2024. 2 trillion. The number was larger than the entire discretionary budget. By February 2025, the target had become 1 trillion. By April, it was 150 billion. By the time DOGE published its final wall of receipts, the claimed figure was $160 billion. $160 billion from a $2 trillion promise. House DOGE caucus leader Blake Moore, a Republican, said on June 5th that Republican members always knew the 2 trillion figure was, quote, a massive exaggeration. They always knew. Now here is the number the mainstream press buried. While DOGE was cutting, the federal government spent $248 billion more in the first 11 months of 2025 than it did in the same period of 2024. More, not less, more. The Cato Institute, a think tank whose entire mission is limited government, analyzed the complete Treasury data and reached this conclusion. Quote, DOGE had no noticeable effect on the trajectory of spending. An observer who did not know when DOGE started, Cato wrote this, could not identify it in the spending data. That line should stop you cold. Here is why. Federal payroll, every civilian employee of the executive branch, accounts for approximately 8% of total federal spending. 8%. A 10% cut in the federal workforce, the Cato Institute calculated, saves roughly $40 billion per year. $40 billion against a $7 trillion budget. DOGE cut roughly 9% of the federal workforce in under 10 months. That is historically extraordinary. The fastest peacetime workforce reduction since the Korean War demobilization. The numbers are real, and the savings, even if fully realized, cannot move the needle, because Social Security and Medicare alone consumed $2.587 trillion in 2025, 37% of the entire federal budget. Social Security outlays rose 8% in a single year. Medicare rose 13%. These numbers do not respond to executive orders. They do not respond to workforce reductions. They respond only to legislation, to statute, to Congress. And Congress, while DOGE dominated the headlines, did not act. Let me name the error precisely, because precision matters here. This is not a story about incompetence. Cutting 271,000 federal workers in under a year, bringing federal employment back to levels last seen in 2014, requires real operational capability. That happened. The machinery worked. The error is a category error. The administration deployed executive authority to solve a legislative problem, and the Constitution does not permit that substitution. The Appropriations Clause is not a suggestion. The power of the purse belongs to the legislative branch, Article 1, Section 9, and no amount of executive energy can transfer that authority to the executive office of the President. Wrong branch. Here is who specifically bears the cost of that error. Every American taxpayer whose share of the national revenue burden increases because the Internal Revenue Service's enforcement capacity has been gutted. 3,600 revenue agents, 31% of the IRS auditing force, departed in the first 3 months of 2025. The division that audits the ultra-wealthy, the global high wealth unit, lost 38% of its staff. Every dollar spent on auditing the top 0.1% of earners returns between $5 and $26 in revenue. That is not an ideological argument. That is a return on investment calculation from the Congressional Research Service. DOGE cut the people generating that return. Then there are the veterans. The Department of Veterans Affairs was placed on a trajectory toward eliminating up to 80,000 positions, while the administration simultaneously expanded the agency's mission. The mission grew, and the budget, because VA benefits are mandatory entitlement spending, did not change. That is not smaller government. That is degraded government at the same price. The ordinary American watching this story did not lose their government services so that the deficit would shrink. They lost them so that Congress would not have to vote. Now, before we run the logic bridge test, I want to give the opposing argument its full weight, because this is what logic bridge does. I will not caricature a position I am about to rebut. The progressive critique of DOGE, articulated in a January 2026 report by the Revolving Door Project and echoed by Democratic members of Congress, is this: DOGE was not a failed efficiency project. It was a deliberate effort to dismantle the essential functions of the federal government. The agents who executed it were unelected, unqualified, and unaccountable. Access to sensitive federal data systems was obtained without traditional oversight. The goal on this reading was not efficiency, it was political control. That is the progressive position, stated accurately, stated charitably. Here is the conservative position, stated with equal precision. DOGE was a legitimate expression of a correct principle. The federal government is too large, too expensive, and too unaccountable to the ordinary Americans who fund it. The impulse was right. The diagnosis was right. The treatment was applied to the wrong organ. Executive authority can reduce headcount. Executive authority can cancel contracts. Executive authority can terminate leases. Executive authority cannot amend a statute, cannot reform an entitlement, cannot change the trajectory of Social Security or Medicare by a single dollar without an act of Congress. The answer to DOGE's failure is not to restore the bureaucracy intact. The answer is for Congress to use the authority the Constitution already gave it. Run the logic bridge test. The mainstream press ran this story as personnel drama. Musk, the chainsaw, the fired workers, the rehired workers, the chaos. That framing served everyone who wanted to avoid the harder question. Here is what the record shows. Federal spending rose $248 billion despite the cuts. The national debt grew over $2 trillion since Inauguration Day. The Internal Revenue Service, the agency that collects 96% of federal revenue, lost a third of its enforcement capacity. And Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill, which independent projections show will add at least $3 trillion to the deficit over the next decade beyond baseline. $3 trillion, new debt. Signed into law the same year DOGE was cutting park rangers and canceling conference rooms. The chainsaw never touched the thing it needed to cut. That is not partisan criticism. That is constitutional arithmetic. Let me bring this home. The principle at stake in this story is not efficiency. It is not even fiscal responsibility, though fiscal responsibility is where the consequences land. The principle is separation of powers. The framers of this Constitution were precise about this. Article 1 vests the power of the purse in Congress, not as a courtesy, not as a tradition, but as a constitutional mandate. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury except through appropriations made by law. The Appropriations Clause is a check on executive power. It was designed to prevent exactly what DOGE demonstrated is now possible: an administration that performs the theater of fiscal discipline while the legislative branch that controls actual spending looks on from the gallery. DOGE has now established a precedent. If that precedent stands, if executive workforce reduction becomes the accepted substitute for legislative entitlement reform, then every future Congress is absolved of its constitutional obligation. The mechanism that prevents fiscal collapse, legislative courage, is replaced by executive spectacle that produces the appearance of discipline while mandatory spending compounds on statutory autopilot. Social Security's trust fund is projected to deplete around 2033. Medicare faces the same structural pressure. Net interest on the national debt is projected to nearly double, from $970 billion this year to $2.1 trillion by 2036. These numbers are not projections by partisan think tanks. They are the Congressional Budget Office's own baseline, published, verified, on record. None of those numbers can be moved by an executive order. Every year, Congress substitutes executive noise for legislative courage. The window for structural reform narrows. The cost of eventual action in benefit cuts, in inflation, in generational debt grows larger and more painful. The ordinary Americans who will bear that cost are not the ones writing the headlines. They are the ones paying the taxes, receiving the Social Security checks, waiting for the VA appointments, counting on the Medicare coverage they were promised. Here is the question this episode leaves you with. We now know DOGE could cut a workforce. We now know it could not cut the debt. We now know the debt is growing, faster, not slower. While the institution constitutionally responsible for addressing it has not taken a single substantive vote on entitlement reform. That is not a DOGE failure. That is a Congress failure, and Congress is the branch you can hold accountable. The question is whether you will.